Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a concept that pops up everywhere. It's called limits of detection, or LOD for short.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
And we've got a whole stack of stuff to go through, scientific papers, industry standards, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
So we're going to figure out what LOD is, why it matters, and how it's used. We might even find some ways to make it better.
It is fascinating how such a technical sounding thing it has such a big impact on our lives, like keeping our food and water safe, or like even discovering new science.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is the limit of detection? It sounds kind of straightforward, but I bet there's more to it than just, detecting something.
Yeah, you're right. There is a nuance to it. It's kind of like trying to hear a whisper in a really noisy room.
Okay.
The LOD is like the quietest whisper you can reliably pick out from all that background noise.
Oh.
It's not just about knowing that something is there. It's about being sure that what you're seeing isn't just, random.
So it's like knowing the difference between an actual smoke alarm going off and just like your neighbor's car alarm going off again. It's no reason.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But why should I care about LOD? I mean, I'm not a scientist.
Well, imagine you're getting a blood test for like a serious condition.
Okay.
A high LOD could mean that the test misses some important marker, and then you would think you're fine, but you're really not.
Oh, wow.
But a really low LOD means they can detect even a tiny trace of that marker and then catch the disease early and maybe save your life.
Whoa. Okay, now I get why it matters. So that means a lower LOD is always better, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
The lower it is, the more sensitive our tests are.
Exactly. A lower LOD means we can detect smaller amounts of whatever we're looking for. This is super important not just in medicine, but in environmental monitoring too, where we want to be able to detect even tiny amounts of pollutants.
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
Or like in food safety, where we need to make sure there's no harmful stuff in our food.
It's starting to feel like a detective story.
Oh.
The lower the LOD, the more clues we can find.
I like that analogy. It really shows how important LOD is in so many different areas.
Okay, so we know LOD is important.
Huh?
But is it the only way to know how sensitive our measurements are? I mean, are there other methods out there, or is LOD like the gold standard?
LOD is really popular because it's easy to understand and calculate,
Okay.
but it does have some limitations. One thing is that it's based on statistical assumptions that may not always reflect real-world data. Real-world data can be messy and may not follow those nice bell curves that we see in textbooks.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution then.
Right.
What happens when the data doesn't behave?
Well, researchers are always trying to find better ways to determine detection limits, especially for messy data. For example, some researchers are turning to something called non-parametric statistical methods, which are more adaptable and don't depend on those strict statistical assumptions.
Non-parametric stats, huh? I vaguely remember those.
Yeah.
Could you remind me what those are? They sound like they could be really useful when you have data that's not playing by the rules.
Basically, they don't make any assumptions about the distribution of the data. So, they don't have to follow a normal distribution.
Sure.
They can be applied to a wider range of data sets. And so they're becoming a game changer, potentially, for figuring out LOD.
So it's like having a more versatile detective tool.
Yeah.
One that can handle all kinds of clues, not just the easy one.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how LOD is always evolving and not just a fixed thing.
Yeah, it's definitely an area of active research, and scientists are always pushing the boundaries of what we can detect and measure.
This reminds me of something I read in one of the papers about hydrogen sensors. Apparently, humidity can really mess with the readings. It seems like that would be a big problem, especially if we're betting on hydrogen being the clean fuel of the future.
You're talking about the research on those neural network nanoplasmonic hydrogen sensors, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
It's a great example of how environmental factors can really impact how well a sensor performs.
Yeah.
And how we need a low LOD for safety and reliability.
Yeah, they were talking about these PD70AO30 sensors. I'm assuming those are some kind of fancy hydrogen detectors.
Yes, they are.
But if they get thrown off by humidity, wouldn't that make them unreliable? Especially in places with weather.
Well, that's where the researchers came up with a really clever solution.
Okay.
They found that by increasing the operating temperature of the sensor, they could actually counteract the effects of humidity and make the sensor more accurate.
So they're fighting fire with fire.
Yeah.
Or humidity with heat.
Exactly.
That's pretty smart. But it also shows that finding the LOD isn't as simple as just, looking at a number on a readout.
Yeah.
There's a lot more science and engineering involved, especially when you have these tricky conditions to deal with.
Absolutely. Figuring out the LOD means you really have to understand the analytical method, the sample, and all the potential sources of error. And it usually involves a combination of smart experimental design and robust data analysis.
Okay, so we've covered why LOD is important and some of the challenges in finding it.
Right.
But how do scientists actually calculate the LOD?
Well, there's a couple of different methods, each with their own pluses and minuses.
Okay.
One common approach is the signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR.
Okay.
Basically, you compare the strength of the signal from what you're trying to detect to the level of background noise.
Okay, so it's like trying to have a conversation at a concert.
Yeah.
The louder you can talk compared to the music,
Yeah.
the easier it is to understand each other.
That's a good analogy.
So a higher SNR means a clearer signal.
Yeah. And a lower LOD, generally. Makes sense. What other methods are out there?
Another common technique is to use what's called a calibration curve.
Okay.
It's like a decoder ring that translates the signal strength into the actual amount of the substance you're measuring.
Oh, okay.
You make a graph by plotting the signal against known concentrations of the stuff you're analyzing.
Okay.
And then by looking at that curve, scientists can determine the smallest concentration they can reliably detect.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good visual. And I'm guessing statistics plays a role here too, right?
Absolutely.
I remember something about standard deviations being important, but it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah, they are really important for figuring out how much variation there is in your measurements.
Okay.
The LOD is often set a certain number of standard deviations above the blank sample. This is to be sure you're actually seeing a real signal and not just random fluctuations.
So it's like setting a limit. Anything above this is real, and anything below is probably just noise.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, cool.
So it seems like there's a lot of math involved in figuring out the LOD.
Definitely.
But it's all about being sure those numbers are reliable,
Right.
Especially when it comes to things like public health or safety.
Exactly. And actually, there's another method that uses standard deviations too.
Okay.
You measure the blank sample, like multiple times,
Okay.
and calculate its standard deviation.
Okay.
And then you add a multiple of that standard deviation to the average blank signal to determine the LOD.
So it's like being extra careful and making sure you're not fooled by randomness in the blank.
Yeah, it's like adding a safety net.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But it's not always about numbers.
Yeah. Not always.
There are other ways to determine LOD.
Yeah, sometimes scientists just look at the data with their own eyes and decide where the signal becomes clear enough to be different from the noise.
Really? Just eyeballing it. Doesn't that seem a bit subjective?
Well, it is more subjective than the other methods.
Yeah.
But it can be useful sometimes, especially if you're dealing with data that doesn't fit neatly into traditional statistical models.
So it's like having an experienced detective who can just spot those clues that a computer might miss.
Right.
I guess it's a reminder that human intuition still matters in science.
Absolutely.
So we've gone over a bunch of different ways to determine the LOD.
Yeah.
From signal-to-noise ratios and calibration curves
Right.
to standard deviations, and even just eyeballing it.
Yeah, it's a whole toolkit.
But there's got to be more to it than just crunching numbers, right?
Right.
I mean, there must be other factors that influence LOD even before you collect any data.
You're absolutely right. Data analysis is important, but it's just one part of the story.
Okay.
There are many other things we can do to optimize LOD even before we even start collecting data.
So it's like getting ready for a big performance.
Yeah.
It's not just about practicing your lines.
Right.
You also have to make sure the stage is set, the lighting is right, and you have a good team behind you.
That's a fantastic analogy. It really emphasizes how important careful planning is to achieving a low LOD. It's all about setting yourself up for success right from the start.
I'm intrigued. Give me some of those pro tips for getting a good LOD. What can we do besides just analyzing data?
Well, first, you want to make sure your sample preparation is good.
Okay.
Minimize any steps that could introduce contamination or make you lose your analyte.
So no accidental spills or cross-contamination?
Exactly. Then you need to choose the right instrument for the job.
Okay.
Different instruments have different sensitivities and noise levels, so you need to pick an instrument that is good for both the analyte and concentration range you're working with.
Makes sense. You want the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And once you have the right instrument, you need to make sure all the settings are right.
Okay.
This means adjusting things like detector gain, integration time, or even sample flow rate. It's all about making sure your signal is strong and the noise is low.
So you're like fine-tuning a musical instrument.
Yeah, exactly.
To get the best sound.
And environmental conditions are super important too. Things like temperature, humidity, and vibrations can all affect how your instruments perform. So maintaining a stable environment can help you get a better LOD.
So like a Zen lab. Keep things calm and controlled.
Precisely. And finally, using good calibration standards is essential.
Right.
The accuracy of your LOD really depends on how good those standards are. So you need to use standards that are traceable to a known reference and that cover the expected concentration range. This ensures you're getting reliable results.
So it's like making sure your measuring stick is accurate.
Exactly.
If your standards are off, everything's going to be wrong.
Precisely. Getting a low LOD is a multifaceted challenge.
Yeah.
It requires careful planning, meticulous execution, robust data analysis.
It's amazing to me how something as technical as LOD can be connected to so many different things.
Right.
It's like detective work and Zen labs and fine-tuning instruments all at the same time.
It's all connected, and even the most niche ideas can have wide-reaching consequences.
I'm feeling really inspired to learn more, but my brain needs a break. Let's take a quick one and come back to explore what the future holds for LOD and what new things it might uncover.
Yeah, sounds good. A little mental break is always good when you're thinking about something complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
Ready to go back to LOD?
Absolutely. I'm ready to see where LOD pops up. I mean, we've talked about medical tests and the environment.
Right.
But I'm sure there's more, right?
Yeah, the applications are huge. It's amazing to see how LOD is important in so many parts of our lives. One area where it's really important is food safety.
Okay.
Making sure our food is safe and doesn't have, pesticides or heavy metals or bacteria really depends on sensitive detection methods.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely don't want to find anything gross in my food. So having a low LOD would give me peace of mind knowing that my food is good.
Exactly. And then there's drug development. You have to measure drug concentrations in, like blood or tissue samples, to make sure they're effective and safe. A low LOD lets researchers track tiny amounts of a drug in the body, which helps them figure out the right dose and how the drug breaks down.
So it's like a tiny tracker that follows the drug and tells us what it's doing.
Pretty much. It's super helpful for making new treatments.
That's cool. Are there any other places where LOD is like super important?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Material science is another area. Scientists need to know exactly what materials are made of, even at really small scales, like the nanoscale, to make new materials with special properties, like making stronger and lighter materials for buildings or more efficient solar panels. LOD is key for understanding how matter works at its most basic level.
Wow, so LOD is literally helping us build the future.
That's one way to put it. And let's not forget about forensics. Detecting tiny bits of evidence at crime scenes like DNA or fingerprints needs incredibly low LODs. Those measurements can be the difference between cracking a case or hitting a dead end.
It's like giving detectives superpowers so they can see clues that are invisible to, regular people.
Right. And how about archaeology?
Oh, wow.
By looking at the composition of ancient artifacts, archaeologists can figure out how old they are and where they came from, giving us more information about history. LOD helps them detect even tiny amounts of elements or isotopes.
Wow.
Which can tell us a lot about the materials and techniques used by, our ancestors.
So we're using LOD to uncover secrets from the past.
I like it.
Yeah.
Are there any uses for LOD beyond our planet?
Definitely. Astronomy needs low LODs too. Astronomers have to use incredibly sensitive instruments to catch those faint signals from distant stars and galaxies. They can figure out what those objects are made of, how far away they are, and even how they're moving. A low LOD lets them peer deeper into space, unlocking those mysteries of the universe. Wow, so we're using LOD to explore both the microscopic world and the vastness of space. That's amazing.
It just goes to show the power of precise measurement and how it can help us understand the world, from the tiniest particles to the largest structures out there.
Okay, all this talk about what LOD can do is making me a little overwhelmed, but it's also really exciting.
It is pretty awe-inspiring.
It's like standing on the edge of this huge ocean of knowledge.
Yeah.
With all these possibilities waiting to be explored.
It's definitely something to think about. But before we get too carried away with the future, maybe we should go back to those methods for figuring out the LOD.
Okay.
We talked about them earlier, but maybe it would be good to go deeper into each one, like making a toolkit for, aspiring LOD detectives.
I like it. Let's take a look at those methods and see what tools are available to help us with LOD.
All right, let's start with the signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR.
Okay.
It's probably the easiest to grasp.
Okay.
Basically, you're looking at the strength of the signal coming from what you're trying to detect and comparing it to the level of background noise, like trying to hear someone talk at a party.
Okay.
The louder they talk compared to the music and chatter, the easier it is to understand them.
So high SNR means a clearer signal and usually a lower LOD. Makes sense. We want to boost the signal and get rid of the noise to make detection more sensitive.
Exactly. Now let's talk about calibration curves.
Okay.
These are super useful for figuring out actual concentrations based on how strong the signal is.
Okay.
It's like a secret code that lets you understand your instrument. You plot the signal response on a graph against known concentrations.
Right.
And then you can analyze that curve and see what's the smallest concentration that gives a signal that's different from the noise.
So it's a map that takes you from the raw data to the real information about the concentration.
Exactly. And then we have those statistical methods that use standard deviation.
Okay.
Remember, standard deviation tells you how spread out your data is, and the LOD is usually set a few standard deviations above the blank sample. That way, you can be sure you're actually seeing a real signal, not just random stuff.
Right. It's like setting a boundary. Anything above this line is real, and anything below is probably just noise.
Exactly. And then there's that other standard deviation method where you measure the blank multiple times and calculate its standard deviation, and then add a multiple of that standard deviation to the average blank signal to get the LOD. It's like adding extra padding to be sure you're not tricked by random fluctuations in the blank.
It's like a safety net for your measurements. I like it.
And lastly, there's the good old-fashioned visual inspection method.
Oh, right.
It's not as objective as the others,
Yeah.
but sometimes just looking at the data with a trained eye can be helpful, especially if the data doesn't fit nicely into those traditional statistical models.
So it's like having a seasoned detective who can pick up on things a computer might miss.
Right. Human experience still has a place in science.
So we've got a bunch of methods for figuring out LOD.
Yeah.
SNR, calibration curves, standard deviation, and even just eyeballing it.
You got it.
Each method has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
Choosing the right one depends on the analyte, the method you're using, and how complicated the data is.
Exactly. It's about picking the best tool for the job.
This whole journey through LOD has been eye-opening.
It is pretty fascinating.
Way more complex and important than I realized. But I'm really excited to explore what the future holds for LOD and all the new things it might uncover.
I agree. The future of LOD is bright. With technology improving and new analytical methods popping up, there's so much potential for what we can detect and measure.
Shall we take a peek into the future of LOD and see what's waiting for us?
Let's do it.
All right, let's take a look into that future of LOD. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the possibilities keep growing. Think about healthcare. What if we could spot diseases before someone even shows any symptoms? With a low enough LOD, we could see those telltale signs of diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's, even at the molecular level.
That would be huge. Early detection is so important for so many conditions. Catching them early could mean more effective treatments and better chances for people.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just early detection. Imagine being able to see how well a treatment is working in real time.
Oh, wow.
If we had a low enough LOD, we could track a drug as it moves through the body.
Wow.
Adjust the dose if needed.
Wow.
And really tailor the treatment plan based on what we see.
That's like having a personal health tracker that's watching over everything and adjusting things as needed. That's the kind of future I want to live in.
Me too. And this ability to measure things so precisely isn't just for healthcare. Imagine what we could do for the environment. We could track pollution with incredible accuracy, seeing even the smallest bits of contaminants in our water, air, and soil.
So it's not just about cleaning up the mess after it happens.
Right.
It's about preventing it in the first place. That would be amazing for the planet.
It would. And needing a lower LOD, needing to see even smaller things, goes beyond our planet too.
Oh, yeah.
Think about space exploration. We could use it to study what distant planets and moons are made of.
Okay.
Maybe even find signs of life out there.
Wow, that's incredible. Finding life on other planets or discovering new elements, things we never knew existed.
It's all about having the right tools and techniques, the ones with super low limits of detection.
It really makes you think about how LOD connects everything, from tiny particles to those huge things in space. It's mind-blowing. But something's been bothering me throughout this conversation.
Oh, what is it?
We've talked about all these awesome things LOD can do.
Yeah.
But figuring out LOD can be tricky, and there's room for variation.
Right.
So how do we know everyone's doing it the same way? If different labs use slightly different methods or instruments, wouldn't it be hard to compare results and really know what's going on?
That's a really good point. And it brings us to something really important about LOD that we haven't discussed yet. Standardization.
Okay.
You're right. If we want to use LOD to its fullest, especially for those future applications we talked about, we need to make sure everyone's on the same page.
So it's not just about having sensitive instruments or fancy algorithms.
Yeah.
It's also about making sure everyone is using the same rules.
Exactly. And that's where organizations like the ISO come in.
ISO.
Yeah, the International Organization for Standardization. They set guidelines and standards for how to do things in science.
Okay.
Including how to determine LOD and how to report it. This helps keep things consistent between different labs and industries.
So it's like having a universal language for science that helps us share what we know and build on each other's work. That's important for making progress, especially in something like LOD.
Exactly. And as we get more and more data, that need for standards becomes even more crucial. It's the foundation for scientists working together to achieve amazing things.
It's incredible how something as seemingly technical as LOD is connected to these bigger ideas like scientific progress, global collaboration, and trying to understand the universe.
It really is remarkable. And speaking of exploring further, remember that paper about non-parametric methods for LOD?
Oh yeah, the one for messy data.
Yeah, it made me wonder, could these non-parametric methods become the go-to way of figuring out LOD in the future as we have to deal with more and more complex data sets?
That's a really interesting question to think about. There's so much room for growth and discovery with LOD. It just shows that even the most technical-sounding concepts can have huge implications for how we see the world and solve problems.
I agree. And for everyone listening out there, I really encourage you to keep exploring LOD. Dive into those papers, play around with different methods, and see where your curiosity leads you. You never know what you might discover.
That's a great call to action for all those future LOD detectives out there. Thanks for taking us on this journey through LOD.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep those brains active, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.